Please pray with me. Open our ears, O God, to hear your word and know your voice. Speak to our hearts and strengthen our wills, that we may serve you today, now, and always. Amen. You know, the images of salt and light that we heard in the gospel readings, those are the images that Jesus expressed to his followers to help inspire them, encourage them, and exhort them in the ministry in the world that they were just beginning. And they're familiar to all of us, I'm sure. We've heard them all our lives. So it shouldn't surprise us then that these powerful messages are part of what we call the Sermon on the Mount, the most well-known sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. And last week we heard the Beatitudes, didn't we, which became before this part about salt and light. So as Jesus climbs up the mountain, he turns to look upon the hundreds of people that have gathered and have started following him in his ministry of healing and teaching. And he knows the spiritual hunger and the physical suffering that so many of the people are experiencing. And he sits down and he begins to teach about the reign of God that's even now in his own person breaking forth in the world. And like every preacher, though, he's preaching in a specific context. And the context he's preaching at today in the Sermon on the Mount is for Israel. He was speaking to Israel during a time of oppression from outsiders, which was a chronic problem since the exile 600 years before. And, you know, there was a heated and even anguished debate about the meaning of their suffering and how to respond. That overarching question, how could God let this happen to us? Remember from last week's sermon, well, you probably don't, but that's okay. There were different factions in Israel that had various answers. Among them were the collaborating Sadducees, the revolutionary, violent zealots, and the striving, studious, righteous Pharisees. So you have all these factions, so Jesus is one more voice, one more answer to the questions that are swirling around in that time and place. And you know, many of those same questions are still swirling around in our time and place. One biblical scholar says that what Jesus was really doing was challenging Israel to be Israel. And like other scholars, people write that Jesus was talking about this inbreaking reign of God that was happening before their very eyes, and that God was already doing a new thing. So what does that new thing look like today? Well, you know, it's February. And it happens to be Black History Month. And I want to raise up a couple things. First, I want to raise up Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They're the founders of Black Lives Matter. And that was in direct response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. And that project that these three women courageously began now has 40 chapters around the world. And it's an ideological and a political intervention in a world where Black lives are systemically and intentionally targeted for demise. It's an affirmation of the humanity of Black lives and their contributions to our society and their resilience in the face of deadly oppression. And then there's Nicole Sherry Hannah-Jones. She's an investigative journalist known for the coverage of the civil rights in the United States, and she's been a staff writer for New York Times, the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, and the Pulitzer Prize winner while she was at the New York Times for commentary for her controversial work, the 1619 Project. Keep that in mind. So, are these women the kind of people that Jesus is talking about when he says, you are the light of the world and you are the salt of the earth? Are they part of this new thing that is the inbreaking realm of God? You know, we, 2,000 years later, who strive to follow in Jesus' path, we continue to watch this new thing that unfolds in our time and era. And we have questions that swirl around us, and as we try and be faithful disciples, and how to respond to the challenges that seem ever present. And so that's what Jesus is doing in this Sermon on the Mount. And so what we heard in the Beatitudes, and this is a hinge, if you will, before Jesus starts talking about some much more difficult things. And so Jesus uses two very common images that were prevalent in that day, and that was salt and light. And he uses the word you, but that's all of us. That's the you that was there, and it's the you that's sitting here today. And like that second generation of Christians that were listening to Jesus, we listen with the crowd to hear the we. How are we the salt of the earth and the light of the world? While Jesus is telling us who or what we are, these metaphors also talk to us about what we do and the effect of what we do in the world. They're dynamic, they're not static, and they're intended to churn things up. Marcia Riggs suggests that Jesus gives the disciples a distinctive capacity to elicit goodness. I love that phrase, a distinctive capacity. But she says that distinctive capacity may be lost if we don't disorder the status quo, if we don't value those who are dispossessed, if we don't care for those who suffer, if we don't do justice, show mercy, and have integrity, if we're not peacemakers, and if we don't courageously stand for what we believe, we may lose that distinctive capacity to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. 2,000 years later, we still understand that salt that isn't salty isn't much good for anything, is it? While just a little flavorful salt can have an impact in a much larger capacity, spreading through the whole recipe, if you will. And so it's a simple, humble image that Jesus uses, salt, and it had a lot of meaning in the time of Jesus. It was not only used to strengthen and preserve food, but in ancient times, it was rubbed on newborn children. It was used to seal covenants. It was sprinkled on sacrifices, and it was understood as a metaphor for wisdom. No wonder then that this small little ingredient, salt, was associated with God's gracious activity. And in every age, we know that light means many things, not the least of which is hope. Earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus spoke of recalling, and he recalled the words of Isaiah, that the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And Jesus tells us then, let our light shine before others. Let the good things that we do bring glory to God and not to ourselves. So I ask again, what do these metaphors of salt and light have to do with the examples of these courageous and outspoken members of the Black community that I referenced just a moment ago? Well, I believe that just like a flavorful salt can have an impact far beyond its size, these amazing people have had a tremendous impact as well. I believe that by their example, they represent the hope that we find in the light that's shown in the darkness. So when I asked at the beginning if the people I raised up are the kind of people that Jesus was talking about, the answer is yes, but not completely. Please hear me. I'm not in any way trying to dismiss or make light of the remarkable courage and accomplishment shown by these founders of Black Lives Matter or by Nicole Hannah-Jones. But two things. First, I don't think you need to be famous on a national stage to be the salt of the earth or the light of the world. But second, I believe those in the Black community have been given a special ability, a special opportunity to influence this country because of their history. But here's the hard question. Is there a chance, just a chance, that the dominant culture in this country doesn't really comprehend the Black history and its influence on this country? Those of us here today, darn near all of us, would be labeled white. And we have a special opportunity to listen and learn. Not speak. Just listen and learn. Remember, I mentioned the Bible scholar that believed that Jesus used the salt metaphor because the disciples had a distinct capacity to elicit goodness. And so the minute I read about this distinctive capacity, I started thinking about women, like I mentioned, the amazing courage to begin Black Lives Matter and to write the Project 1619. Now, I have to tell you, it's not easy for me to raise them up as something special. I don't necessarily like to single out groups or individuals, because sometimes when that happens, it makes things difficult. But Jesus is saying in these verses that it's about what we do in the world that really matters. And so as people of God, especially as people who have had their lives every single day to face discrimination, rejection, marginalization, just because of the color of their skin, how they live their lives is something we need to see and to understand. The jobs that they could never have, that they still can't have, the schools that they can't attend, the endless places they've not been safe, that they're still not safe, the lives that have been savagely taken and continue to be taken, a world that demonstrates its prejudice daily. They've faced all of this individually and collectively, yet so many have continued to put forth love, compassion, tolerance, mercy, and demand justice. Their courage is breathtaking. And we have a chance to honor the history of Black lives this month, to learn from them. And at the end of this sermon, I'm going to give you an assignment. It's probably the most unusual assignment I've ever given a congregation. Today, though, we also have a chance to ask ourselves how we might be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. I know none of you are perfect. I know that we've all said and done things in response to what has been directed toward us that we're not proud of. I get that. But I also know that you've sought and continue to seek and to fight and to stand for mercy and display integrity and courageous stand for what you believe in. And you've not faltered. You've not tried to walk away from what you believe. You indeed have a distinctive capacity. We're called in this world to make a difference. so that all who watch us feel new life. They might feel new hope as they come forward. And if we are the salt of the earth, we won't find comfort and assurance in being something, but we'll find purpose and integrity in doing something significant. That something will work a difference in the world around us rather than simply conforming to the values of the culture that surround us. We are not the light itself, but we are the window through which the light can be seen. So here's what I'm asking you to do today. I've been watching TV again. And, I'd heard of the Project 1619, and I thought because, I'm so liberal, that I didn't need to read it. I got it, Well, it's on Hulu in 4 episodes, and I can't begin to tell you how uncomfortable it made me. So what I want you to do, I want you to watch it on Hulu, and if you don't subscribe, I want you to subscribe, and then you can watch it, and then you can cancel. I do that all the time. It's that important. Now, I also ordered the book, because of course I did, but it's being delivered today. But it's different watching it, because you see it, and you hear it, and you feel it. But I'm here to tell you it made me really uncomfortable, because I didn't necessarily like some of the conclusions. That's what I needed to hear, and that's what I needed to learn. And something tells me that maybe we all could hear it and learn. I don't know what we'll do after we've all watched it. I wish we could subscribe and watch it at church, but...
Wow, that's a big bill.
Yeah, that's a big bill, but let's talk about it. I want to know who watched it, because it will change you. And you'll understand in a different level what it is to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, and what our role is in that. Sometimes I like to quote Eugene Peterson, who did a paraphrase, if you will, of the Bible called The Message. So verse 14 of our reading today from The Message goes like this. We're going public with this. As public as a city on a hill. Now that I've put you there on a hilltop, on a light, shine. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives.